It's here, the big EU summit that everyone's been eyeing for months, the one where Emmanuel Macron was going to launch the fight back against right-wing populism with the rolling out of reforms that make the euro work for its citizens. Now that the dates arrive, though, that's all been upstaged by the battle over borders. The captain of this ship seems to be Italy's new interior minister, far-right leader Matteo Salvini, who every day, it seems, has been targeting Macron. He even started the week with a surprise trip to Tripoli in Libya to hammer home the point that he'd no longer let in rescue ships. Last weekend's preparatory summit on the migrant crisis proving inconclusive, so expect plenty of fireworks in Brussels. Some even wonder if the German chancellor's job is at stake, her hardline Bavarian interior minister holding his fire till after the summit on tightening the border with Austria, whose right-wing chancellor wants an axis of the willing, as he calls it, and is getting ready to take over the rotating presidency of the EU. It's immigration that tipped the scales in favor of Brexit in the UK. Will it now tear apart the whole of Europe? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Europe's big divide. And joining us, Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the news website Le Monde Moderne, the modern world. How are you?
Good, thank you.
We also want to welcome international arbitration. We could use an international arbitration attorney. Eduard Salsas is with us. Thanks. A pleasure to have you. Joining us from London, independent member of the European Parliament, Janice Atkinson, formerly with UKIP, and who sits with the same parliamentary group as Salvini's League Party. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Good evening.
And from London, Nina Schick, Director of Data and Polling at Rasmussen Global. Welcome back to the show.
Pleasure.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. The day began with the German Chancellor honoring the tradition of first briefing her parliament before traveling to Brussels for a summit. This time, Angela Merkel sounding the alarm.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, Europa hat viele Herausforderungen.
Dear colleagues, Europe has many challenges, but migration could end up determining the EU's destiny. Unless we are able to find a solution that will show people in Africa and elsewhere that we are guided by our values, no one will believe in the very values that made us so strong. That's why this is so important. Thank you very much.
Alexis Poulain, we're taught as journalists not to oversell a story, right? And it seems as though every time there's a big crisis in Europe, we're saying this is the summit where everything gets decided. Here, when the German Chancellor says that Europe's destiny is at stake, is she overselling it, or is it spot on?
No, I do say the same, actually. I think the issue of migration have been on the table for 15 years, and the last 5 years have been very critical with Syria, and there have been summit of the last chance, and the commission of Jean-Claude Juncker was supposed to be the last chance commission, or commission of a political commission. It failed because the EU nation state are into a new era where you have the Salvinis coming to power. Austria is turning also to extreme right, or to a strong right, let's say. And Orban is now a strong man in Europe. He was unknown a few years back. Well, he was known to some people, but now he's known on the international stage. And I think the whole world has changed. There's been a shift with Donald Trump being elected as well, having very strong policy with a wall and saying migration is a big problem. So migration was a big problem in 2015 when, of course, we had this peak in the migrants. Then the EU had a deal with Turkey. We closed the borders. And now the problem we have is how do we integrate these people, and the long-term issue of migration, which is here to stay. And Merkel is right saying, if we don't do anything, if we don't have a plan, a long-term plan, not just this summit plan, then Europe is at stake.
But she's already managing expectations. Nina Schick, ahead of the summit, she warned there won't be an overriding deal. It'll, at best, be side deals between nations. Is nonetheless the destiny of Europe at stake?
This is absolutely an existential question for the EU. On one side, you have people like Angela Merkel, who in 2015, whether or not you agree with it, made a very huge humanitarian gesture. I mean, she herself realized that perhaps it was too much. What she's saying is that this is an issue that is going to face the rest of Europe, and we have to come up with a common solution. If we start taking measures unilaterally, like Italy is doing or like Austria is doing, where you just close the borders, this is an issue that's not only going to tear apart the EU, but it's not going to go away. On the other hand, you have people like Mr. Salvini, and you see the rise of these parties across Europe who are using identity politics around the migration crisis in 2015. You have the AfD in Germany to really get to the fore in their countries. And the question is if traditional politicians and the center left, center right, the liberal parties don't manage to get a hold of this and convince the public that they can manage this issue, then increasingly the public are going to flock to the arms of outright fascist parties, as we're seeing across Europe. So I think this is absolutely a crisis point for the EU. And if they fail to address this coherently, then unfortunately, I think we are going to see the rise of some very nasty parties.
So what are you expecting from the summit?
Well, I think that, of course, they'll have a statement where they'll come to some kind of joint agreement that this is an issue that needs to be tackled. What Merkel is doing is trying to push for bilateral deals with with other EU countries. The question really for Merkel is also an existential one about her domestic tenure. If she doesn't manage to get enough, then her Bavarian sister party, well, they've threatened to topple her. So let's see what comes out of the summit and whether or not the Bavarian sister party will really pull the trigger in German politics, because of course that would be a huge symbol for the rest of the EU as well.
Janice Atkinson, of course, the UK is not part of the Schengen agreement zone for the open borders. Nonetheless, is there a stake for Britain?
Look, these migrants that are coming up, they don't want to stay in the southern states of Italy where there's high unemployment, and Spain and Greece. They want to break into the northern European countries. And we've got people sitting, thousands of them still sitting in Calais trying to invade my country. So we are absolutely affected by it. And Nina's sort of shrill attitude, yeah, absolutely, invade. And I tell you why, because it's the likes of the UN, the UNIOM, the UNHCR, and the Commission, and the likes of Angela Merkel that are saying that we should be replacing our populations, because we need to replace our populations because we have the demographics are not right. So what you're doing is encouraging people to come from the Middle East, encouraging the Africans. And what we should be doing is building the walls on the borders, as Orban is doing. We should be building the walls in the southern and the northern states of Libya and Egypt, etc., to stop them coming. And the message should go out.
So you're arguing for a common European. You're arguing for a common solution. You're arguing for a common solution then for protecting the borders.
No, I'm not. No, because the EU has failed, and that's why you have got the likes of AfD, Salvini, Kurz, and Sebastian Kurz.
So borders around each nation state?
They're the people that are appealing. The people are voting for them. They're not voting for the likes of Merkel anymore or Macron. They were the future once, and now the future is Salvini. We are the parties that have got the ideas to stop the migration, because to stop keeping Africa in poverty. Common agricultural policy dumps 30 billion of EU goods onto Africa. We should have a fair trading policy. Stop the foreign aid going into the despots' pockets. That we've already given Erdogan, who's an Islamist, £6 billion to hold 2.5 million people back from our borders. And they've also proposed another £6 billion. We've got an African EU fund.
All right, let me turn to Eduard Salsas. Let me turn to Eduard Salsas here, because the trend across Europe is not all towards swinging to the right. Case in point, Spain. The new kid on the block at this summit is the Social Democrats leader, Pedro Sanchez. What are the views right now in Spain? Spain, which welcomed that first of those two rescue ships that we're going to talk about in a moment.
Well, luckily, the trend in Spain is different, and very luckily. Pedro Sanchez was elected as prime minister with a very fragile parliament, but at least on this migrant issue, he might have the support of the parliament, because all the parties that supported him for the investiture will support him a priori in this migrant policy. It was very important for him to go to Brussels with a strong message. Pedro Sánchez cannot act internally because his budget has been decided by the former government, so he needs to act like to the outside in his foreign policy, and this migrant crisis might be very good for him to show a change in the Spanish politics, a change in the way he's going to do politics. It is also important to highlight that Spain has been in the front row of receiving migrants through.
Because there's three routes for migrants. There's the Balkan route. There's via Libya and Tunisia, and there's via Morocco and Algeria.
Morocco, Algeria, and Spain. For the time being, Morocco and Algeria have been blocking a lot of these routes. So, taking advantage of the weakness of the Libyan government, the Libyan route is preferable for migrants. In any case, it is clear that Spain is a major actor in this foreign policy, the European foreign policy, in order to decide what to do with the migrants policy.
And Sanchez, who really wants a Europe-wide solution. Again, as we said at the outset, we're not going to get it this weekend.
Yes, of course, but he needs to make a very strong point to affirm his position, I guess, in the European context and also in the domestic context. As I was saying before, from a domestic policy, he cannot do much because the budget has already been decided, so he cannot develop his policies, but he needs to give a strong message from a domestic point of view to the Spanish voters, that to show that he's a capable prime minister and that he has, strong policies to carry on.
All right, it's all come to a head because of two rescue vessels in the past weeks. First, there was the Aquarius, which Spain eventually took in, and now the Lifeline, managed by a German NGO, allowed to dock in Malta, Italy, making a point of refusing both. The same, though, can be said for others, including France, whose president singled out the charity, which is called Mission Lifeline, for defying, as Emmanuel Macron put it, all the rules when it took migrants onto its boat last week when the Libyan Coast Guard was already intervening. Alexis Poulain, we're getting two messages from the French, aren't we?
A lot. It's en même temps, in the same time. It's very Macron-like. I mean, you have what we do internally in France is a very tough policy on immigration, with border control with Italy, slashing souls of migrants, putting them back in Italy. Gérard Collomb saying that,
the Interior Minister
of France saying we have to be really tough. And Macron is using the words, that Salvini is using, saying that NGOs are taxis for migrants to some extent, which is unacceptable. He's playing the game. It's a very dangerous game.
Although in the case of this one vessel, though, it's in Libyan waters. Normal procedure is you hand them back to the Libyan Coast Guard.
Sure. That's normal procedure if you say so, but using the same word and saying, okay, at one point, Libya has no state. You know that when you're a migrant, you come to Libya, you got torture camps, it's very difficult, it's hell, and you bring them back. I think this is the end of the road, and then you have the water, and then you die in the water, or you come in Europe, but you can't just use a speech as a French president if you want to say we need a common solution that is using same words as Salvini. You have to be very careful about what you're saying about NGOs' work, because if NGOs weren't there, states wouldn't do nothing. And we talk about Frontex, and Frontex had no boats, no people, no border, not enough. And Europe it's on the table, but for the next 5 years, not now. The urgency has been there for so many years that without NGOs, that would be a massacre right there.
Are the NGOs doing what states should be doing? And was this ship, Eduard Salsas, defying all the rules, as Emmanuel Macron puts it?
Well, first of all, there's a state in Libya. So there's a state.
Well, there's actually two states, right? Because there's two different rival governments.
One state, and then there's another faction, another part of the country claiming to want to succeed the state. But in any event, there's a state of Libya. The current situation in Libya is that they are facing a lot of domestic difficulties, and then therefore they have trouble in handling so many people, so many migrants transiting through their country. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that this particular vessel was in a very particular situation, and what Emmanuel Macron and I join you with your views that the policy cannot be decided on one vessel. This one particular case, it may very well be that it's more convenient not to render the vessel back to the Libyan authorities and bring it to another European port. But the important thing and the key thing is to decide a common foreign policy and to provide the necessary funds to Frontex to face this migratory crisis and to provide the necessary aid to the border countries such as Morocco, such as Libya, such as Turkey, in order to organize. I don't know if the solution is to stop, not to stop, but at least to organize this migration. There's a migration flow, and we probably the debate should be how should we organize this flow so that it fits well to everybody.
There was an original document ahead of the summit, which has since been taken off the table, Nina Schick, which talked about disembarkation centers. Critics likened that to concentration camps, places outside or at the borders of the European Union. Also, these talks about these hotspots where they'll process requests to enter the EU. Your thoughts on where it should all go?
Well, the idea of hotspots and disembarkation centers is one that's been touted since 2015, but I want to come back to another point, and I think it's particularly salient when you consider what one of the other panelists, Ms. Atkinson, had to say here. I think that whilst the EU is squabbling over this, and they've been doing it since 2015, what the mainstream is failing to recognize is the anger, the outright xenophobia and anger in parties across Europe that's represented by, some of the views that Ms. Atkinson just voiced. I mean, it's extraordinary, that angry tirade we just heard there about immigrants coming to invade the country and build a wall. That is the thing, I think, which is the most dangerous. I mean, we've already seen it with Lega in Italy. They're doing very well. Salvini, his victory is completely based on his anti-immigrant rhetoric. And the question really is, now, if Europe is to survive and the EU is to survive, how do you take these populists, xenophobes, and actually racists, which outright fascism, in my view, how do you take them and really address them without, talking about hotspots, this and that? The EU has to do something that looks like it's in control of this situation, because otherwise you're completely going to lose the argument. And I'm a historian, so it's very interesting to see how the parallels in the 1930s, where we saw the return to authoritarianism, outright nationalism, and ultimately fascism. And I would go so far as saying that we are seeing some of those trends now across Europe as well, not only in Europe, but across the world. And rather than seeming that we have no control over this at all, policymakers really need to wake up and understand that what might seem as a fringe movement, or the alt-right movement, for example, is increasingly going to become the trend.
So what should be done at this summit?
I think, well, obviously what should be done is that the EU should show that it has control of its exterior borders. So, for example, how can Schengen work if the EU has no control over exterior borders? Second, I think it's very important that people understand the differences of issues going on here. Everything is conflated into one. There are asylum seekers, economic migrants, legal migration, and as we saw during the Brexit referendum campaign, all of that was conflated into one issue. The UK has an opt-out out of EU home and asylum policy. So all the migration we saw in 2015 in Europe, it wasn't coming to the UK, because the UK said we exercise our opt-out, so therefore we're not taking part in any quota sharing. But that anger and that fright around the migration crisis in 2015 manifested in the referendum crisis. In the referendum, which we saw Britain voting for Brexit. So the first thing the EU has to do is maintain its exterior border. And secondly, I think politicians have to clearly recognize what's going on and recognize that some of these movements, which might be considered fringe or extreme, are actually gaining the upper ground. And therefore I say it's really an existential question.
All right, through it all, there's, again, as we've been saying, the finger pointing between Macron and Matteo Salvini, the French president, pointing to the dramatic drop in those trying to cross the Mediterranean since 2015, even as some still try their luck.
We talk about Italy, about the ships that are arriving, NGO ships. We're talking about a situation where the migratory flows have decreased by 80% compared to last year. So nobody can tell me that there's a migratory crisis today. It's a political crisis resulting from the Italian elections, which is linked to this topic. It's absolutely true. We have a rise in the extreme parties everywhere in Europe because of this migratory phenomenon. But is there today a migratory wave across Europe? No, much less than last year and in 2015.
Yeah, and those numbers, according to official statistics, have dropped dramatically since 2015. It was more than a million back in 2015, and it's so far in 2018, it's 43,000. Janice Atkinson, are we exaggerating the threat?
No, let me pick up on a few points which your other commentators made. Let's not tell the electorate a lie and your viewers a lie that the Pedro Sanchez, the socialist, was actually elected. It was the failure of it was the collapse of the Conservative government that just saw him elected. There was no actual election there. So
is Emmanuel Macron, let's stick to the topic here first. Is Emmanuel Macron lying when he says that the number of migrants coming in has decreased by 80%?
Well, I was down in southern Spain a few weeks ago and I met with the Guardia Civil that have to deal with it on the front line of the southern states. Last year, they had 20,000 illegal migrants climbing over the walls in Ceuta and Melilla, which are the Spanish enclaves in Morocco. This year, he expects 40,000. And now, because those other routes are cut off in Libya, they're going to go exponentially through the roof. Now, also, the African population in the next 10 years is going to double. It's going to double to 2.5 billion people. And 80% of the people that are still coming are economic migrants. They're not asylum seekers. And the sad fact in all of this is because of the EU encouraging these people to come, we are losing those that are desperately in need of asylum. And those are the ones that we should actually be worrying about. And as for the rise of the so-called populist parties, again, your self-styled historian female interviewer there is she should sit in the European Parliament. They stopped calling us xenophobes and racist because they knew that they were getting, the likes of Manfred Weber and Verhofstadt were getting a backlash from their own voters, and that's why they're turning to alternatives. And it's us on the right, the Brexit people, Salvini, Straka, Kurz, that have the arguments, and we have the answers, like Viktor Orban. And to call people xenophobes and racist, you are denigrating a whole load of voters because the so-called mainstream left and liberals and the so-called conservatives, they don't have the answer. That's why Merkel is facing to be pushed out. That's why Macron doesn't have the answers. Why do you think he's now parroting exactly what Salvini's saying? So the numbers are still there. They're just in holding pens. We've paid Erdogan £6 billion, and there's no audit trail for that money. Where are the €6 billion that have gone into his coffers? Where are the billions that have gone into Africa? They've gone into the despots' pockets. They've gone into the people traffickers' pockets, which aids and abets terrorism. We've got to close our borders, build the walls, and just say, don't come.
Nina Schick.
I would love to respond. I mean, Janice is saying, something that many people who are on the far right, who are in xenophobic, racist parties say, and that is that, you're calling all of us stupid by calling us xenophobes and racist. Nonsense. I mean, there are a lot of voters, of course, who have legitimate concerns who are turning to these parties, and that's exactly my case in point. This conversation should not be allowed to be hijacked by people like Ms. Atkinson, who has abhorrent views. I mean, only in June, she was speaking at the Free Tommy Robinson defense, who was here in London.
Absolutely.
Tommy
But he's
Robinson is
president
known
of
to be a
the UK.
fascist, racist, xenophobic leader. She was speaking
isn't.
as part of this
No,
movement
isn't.
to free him
No,
because
isn't.
he's in jail. Let's not
isn't.
forget what's happening in Italy with Lega Nord. Salvini, what did he say? He talked about cleaning the streets of vermin, talking about immigrants. Then he also said that there has to be a census on Roma and that those who didn't have citizenship papers in Italy would be removed, but that those who had Italian citizenship would unfortunately be allowed to stay. So this idea that these far-right, alt-right parties are not xenophobic, are not racist, is nonsense. Call a spade a spade. But then, of course, you have to think about what are the failings in mainstream
that's rather
politics that
racist
allows
remark,
voters to
isn't
go
it?
to parties
Call a
like
spade
this.
a spade.
We
That's
should
a bit
never
racist.
forget what happened in European history not too long ago. Fascism doesn't arrive on your doorstep goose-stepping with a little moustache saying, I'm fascism, I'm here to stay. It begins by appealing to people's
Adam.
nationalistic
You are
sentiments, by
disgusting.
feeling proud again. It's a very, very dangerous road to go down, and I think that people like Ms. Atkinson have to be called out. Everybody needs to call people like this out for their abhorrent and unacceptable views.
I agree.
And you can
I
call
think
out the millions of people around the EU that are voting for
that's
us.
it. I think she should have a voice.
I suggest you come to a launch of my book next week, Migration Crime Wave.
Okay.
That's
Great.
going to be launched on the
Cool.
4th of July. These are the figures that the EU
This is like your
Can I-
conspiracy theory. that
I would
you
like
want
to add
borrow.
something.
All right, one at a time. One at a time. Let me bring in Alexis Poulain.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's good that you both and us four and five have a voice. Everybody needs to have a voice. But a xenophobe needs to be called a xenophobe. I do agree with this. And the problem is not so much the stranger, the migrants. The problem is the economic world we live in, where you allow capitals, bankers, and money to thrive and go from one continent to the other. And then you tell to people that once economic migrants have the right to move, to get jobs, to get money. But you say to these guys, oh, wait, no, you stay in your shitty country, you get the bombs on your head, don't move. This is nonsense. At one point, we have to change the way we live altogether. And of course, helping Africa, getting rid of dictators was one thing, but then you have to have a plan and say the economic development, we have to think of Europe as the Euromed. What's going on in Northern Africa and in Africa also matters for Europe. Building walls is a silly idea.
Are you surprised to see in such a short spate of time, the general election in Italy was March the 4th, that now a leader of the far right who is not even at the summit is the main talking point, Matteo Salvini?
Of course he's the main, because he's got, like, now he's elected minister, and he can talk to a lot of people because the press is there when he talks. Before that, he was just a party leader. The fact that this country's turned to the xenophobic dream, or at least it's a lie, works because that's the only answer you can give to people that actually fear the fact that they're losing money, they're losing job, and that we live in that kind of world. But they don't have a solution. When you say that they have a solution, in fact they don't. Building walls, as I said, is not a viable solution.
All right, we know that the barbs that have been traded between Macron and Salvini didn't stop the French president from secretly meeting with the Italian prime minister when he was in Rome this week. Macron did not cross paths with Salvini, but there was no avoiding the issue of migrants in an audience at the Vatican, where Pope Francis urged the French president to show compassion. All the while, the slanging match continues with the new interior minister of Italy. We can show you a tweet from earlier in this day by Italy's interior minister, where he's asking, but have you ever seen anyone caress the Pope? Every day there's something new, Eduard Salsas. Your thoughts on this and the fact that every day there's I mean, this is unprecedented between two neighboring countries like this.
Well, indeed, the tension that we are currently seeing between France and Italy is kind of unprecedented, because neighboring countries who have got along well in the past, and now there's this big tension because of the migrants. In any event, it's true. I completely agree with the fact that not all the people who vote these parties are xenophobics, but indeed they have fears and they have ideas and they need to be. I believe that the role of the European Union is to explain to these people where's the source of the problem and what is being done with the migrants. I completely agree as well with the fact that you cannot stop migrant flow with a wall. It's people will find their way around the wall. So you need to try to solve the solution from the roots, and from the roots is trying to deal with the crisis in Africa or in the Middle East, and what happens there has an effect on us.
Yeah, that's really the fact that you can't, give lessons if you don't act. And of course, we did a bit in Syria, but what we did in Libya, French people, was a big mistake, let's say. There was no plan.
Ousting Gaddafi.
Yeah, ousting Gaddafi, and look where we are. And you can't just say, okay, Italy, you do this, and Europe has to have a plan. But the plan is that we put boats in the Mediterranean and we talk with leaders of Africa and see, what's going on there. Do you want your young people stay and work in Africa or not? And what is the future for these guys?
Nina Schick, speaking of building a wall, we got the news yesterday that Donald Trump is going to be meeting at the White House, both with the European Commission president, but also with the Italian prime minister. I know that inside the closed doors, a lot of the discussion after that G7 summit where Trump was defiant among EU leaders is how to handle Trump when he comes to Brussels next month for that NATO summit. How should EU leaders be handling Donald Trump?
Well, I think that's the question that they're all asking themselves. But this goes back to my fundamental point about this issue being an existential one, not only for the EU, but across the world. Of course, Donald Trump, infamous for his policy, his zero tolerance policy, where he decides to separate children from their parents and lock them into cages, is similarly of this same kind of political playbook where you appeal to people's sense of nationalism, you appeal to their identity, you talk about how he's going to make America great again, the same thing that we see the populists doing in the European scene. And let's not forget that Donald Trump has, been extraordinarily vocal about, how he was backing Brexit, how he backs parties like Salvini's. Only last week, he did an extraordinary attack on Chancellor Merkel of Germany when he tweeted false statistics about the crime rates in Germany and said that this has to do with migration. Now, that false narrative has been perpetuated by the AfD in Germany, who said that Donald Trump was correct, adding fuel to the fire. So again, my fundamental point here is that we are almost in an identity battle across the Western world, and it comes down to this question of migration, values, whatever that is meant to mean. And I think this is a very, very dangerous territory that we're entering. And I'm not saying, I want to clarify, that all voters are xenophobic or that they're racist, but that increasingly they are turning to parties who are. And these parties are able to tell people that they're the only parties who can address their concerns, which are real and legitimate. And therefore, the EU needs to get its act together. And it's interesting to see Donald Tusk, the European Council president, tweet something exactly to that effect yesterday, that it cannot be that public opinion believes that by only turning to these really radical parties will some of their concerns around identity and migration be addressed.
Let me ask you just briefly about domestic politics in Germany, because the interior minister there, who heads the sister party of the ruling conservatives, the CSU, Horst Seehofer, holding his fire during this summit, but he could again rekindle hostilities with the chancellor once it's all over. Is her job at stake with this summit?
Absolutely. One could argue that this is one of the most important summits of her career. What she has promised Seehofer is that she will try to do some kind of deal on the EU level, because she believes that European countries should not act unilaterally, that there has to be a European solution. And if Germany were to do what other countries have done in Europe, that is to say, just close the borders, not allow migrants in, then there is no point of working together. But Seehofer, of course, who used to be the president of Bavaria, his party, let's not not forget, they're facing a very, very important regional election in Bavaria in October. They are terrified of losing a lot of the vote to the AfD. The AfD, which was almost wiped out as a party, but then resurged after the migration crisis in 2015, obviously have seats in the Bundestag now. And that is the reality in German politics. So again, I want to make my fundamental point that these parties who might be seen as extremists or on the fringes, they cannot be allowed to hijack this issue, make it a very toxic issue, and therefore gain electorally, because it seems that the mainstream or the traditional parties don't have a handle on it. And I think that what we see in Europe is going to be something that plays out over many more years to come. I think this could be the dividing issue that breaks up the EU.
Eduard Salsas, the issue that was supposed to be the dominant one at this summit was Eurozone reform. The new French president made it a big campaign pledge, changing the narrative on a more integrated EU to avoid the financial crisis, the likes of which battered Spain, and is still, which is still feeling the effects. It's been completely sidelined. What is it? We have 1 minute left, and we haven't talked about it yet. What does that tell you?
Well, for me, the fact that they don't speak anymore about this is that the European agenda is marked by public opinion and by these debates. And I completely agree that they should not be hijacked, because the European policies long term are much more than punctual crises.
Can these two issues work in parallel universes? Immigration and border policy on the one hand, and Eurozone integration on the other?
Well, of course,
are they the same thing, because they're both about sovereignty in a way?
Well, they're both about sovereignty, but I believe that especially the economic analysis that needs to be done is to rationalize the market and to rationalize the migratory flows.
And it's all about working together. Are European states really ready to work together? Because all this is just a theater of shadows, but they are actually just pretending to be friends and allies. But with Trump coming for the NATO summit in 2 weeks, I mean, we only have on the table the defense, Europe of defense, and Eurozone, of course, is very important. The political crisis that Europe is in is a critical one, because the whole integration business now has to come to another level. And are nation states ready for this? Well, the question is there.
We'll leave it there. I want to thank you very much, Alexis Poulain. I want to thank as well Eduard Salsas, Janice Atkinson, and Nina Schick for being with us from London. Stay with us.